Good evening from Rocky Mountain PBSI News. I'm Cynthia Hessen. This is Colorado's State of Mind. Millions of tons of waste from fracking are disposed of in pits around the western region in energy-producing states. We'll find out from Dan Boyce of Inside Energy how the boom in oil and gas development has increased concern about toxic emissions from those waste sites and the call for regulation. But we begin this evening with Proposition 105, the measure on the statewide ballot this year that calls for specific labeling on foods that have been made with genetically modified ingredients, also called GMO. Here in Colorado, as in Oregon, where a similar measure is on the ballot, the side which is against such labeling has been pouring millions of dollars into the ad campaign against it. Monsanto, PepsiCo, Kraft Foods, General Mills, those are some of the companies fighting the ballot question in both states. On the pro side are the people who brought the initiative to the ballot, who say consumers have a right to know what they're buying and eating. This year, in a pilot project, 20 Colorado voters spent time studying all the arguments for and against. It's probably safe to say they know far more than most voters on this question, and tonight we're going to talk with two of them about what they decided. This group was chosen for the Citizens Initiative Review Panel, and they spent 3.5 days recently hearing presentations and deliberating over the GMO question, and then writing up a one-page summary for their fellow voters that may be helpful to read before you cast your vote. And we'll tell you how to find that. But first, let me introduce two of the voters on that panel. Bill Wright of Parker, a retired Xcel Energy employee and tax auditor, and also Ben Hamilton of Denver, a human resources consultant. With them, Brenda Morrison of Engaged Public, which is the firm that facilitated the Citizens Initiative review. Brenda, this has apparently been very successful in Oregon. How did it come to Colorado as a pilot project?
Oregon, like Colorado, is an initiative state, which means that voters have even more responsibility in that we have the ability to make public policy ourselves at the ballot every couple of years. So Oregon, several years ago, implemented the Citizens Initiative Review as a means to give voters even more information, to think that that often voters are given information through newspapers, through the Voter's Guide or the Blue Book here in Colorado. But they thought it would be interesting to hear, to be honest, what other Coloradoans that represent the state think about an issue. So they began implementing this in 2008 and have run it every 2 years since then, and are expanding it to other initiative states, including Arizona and Colorado.
So it is a voter guide by voters, essentially, and not, of course, not by partisans on either side of the initiative, or lawyers, maybe, who can describe it in legalese sometimes.
Right. It's written for voters, by voters.
Bill, right, you told me that you had a certain position coming into this whole process and ended up with another one. How did you first become part of the panel?
The way that I became aware of it is I was emptying the trash in our office one day and found out I'd received a letter from, it looked like an official from the state or from the group. My wife had thrown the application away, and I pulled it out and looked at it and read it. And I thought that was something that interested me. I'm politically minded, and so I proceeded to fill the application out. And as I read through it, I remembered that I had been requested to sign a petition at Vitamin Cottage that concerned GMOs. And so I thought this might be a really good opportunity to learn more about it. And so I completed the application, filled it out, and was later notified that I had been accepted onto the group, into the group.
So Ben, tell us how that went in 3.5 days. I know you had 3 presentations that were giving you both sides of the argument, I believe, on the impact, the explanation of the issue. How did that all fall out?
Well, I really appreciated the process from beginning to end, because I think, like many panelists that were on the panel, that we thought this was part of the Blue Book. And so at the very beginning of the 3.5 days, we learned about how the Blue Book is developed in Colorado, and that was very insightful. And then over the next 3 days, then really delving into this particular issue of Prop 105 with the 3 panels, as you mentioned, and then a lot of small group deliberation, which was really where I think a lot of the issues and a lot of the the important facts for the panelists came out.
Did this strike you as sort of an emotional issue, or were you all able to be dispassionate about it?
Well, that was actually part of the conversation we had on the first day, is how do we really take us as emotional beings, being humans, and separate some of that emotion that we might attach to this particular initiative, and really look at it from the eyes of all voters and what facts were going to be most important for them to make their choice.
Well, let's talk about some of the results that you came to. First of all, you decided, Bill, as you looked at it, that you hadn't realized which foods would be covered by this ballot initiative.
I really didn't know. I assumed that if it was a piece of legislation, that it would be fairly comprehensive, and if it was approved, that when I go into the store to shop, I would know which foods contain GMO material and which ones didn't.
But that's not true, according to the way it's written.
That is not true. Approximately 2/3 of the foods that are available in the store would not be covered by this legislation. There are probably over 400,000 foods that are sold in the store, and so if you look at 2/3 of that, that's quite a few food items that are not covered by this legislation.
Did you get any insight about why it was written that way from the proponents that presented to you?
Yes, the explanation was that a lot of the foods are covered by other regulation, not necessarily giving you information about GMO material, but just that the federal government regulates the foods, and so it's not covered in this piece of legislation. I thought that was just interesting.
More than interesting. I think you told me you thought this was poorly written.
Yes, I did. Normally when you go into a store and you read labels, I think people rely on the information, that it's fact of, if food contains peanuts, people have allergies to peanuts, so they want to know that they can rely on what they're being told. And so in this case, the legislation in its present form does not do that.
So Ben, what do you think of that part of it? Does it concern you that it only would apply to certain types of foods?
I recognize, and again, just going through the 3.5-day process, that there are a lot of pieces of the food supply that are exempt. And I would offer that no law that we ever pass anywhere, legislative or by the voters, is ever perfect. So I would like to see it expanded to include some of those other currently exempted food supplies. But I think it's an important start. And again, if we really want to know what's in our food supply, we have to start somewhere.
Now that's something I'd take issue at. Like I said, 400,000 food items that you typically see in a store. If 300,000 of them aren't covered, that's not very informative. In fact, it's probably and in a lot of cases where the way the legislation is written, a lot of food items that don't have GMOs would have to be labeled as though they do have GMOs, and vice versa. That's going to be a lot more confusing than if you just didn't do it at all.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I respect that, but I would also, again, another reason I like the way this particular proposition was written, and I think I mentioned it to Cynthia before, that it is a statutory amendment, not a constitutional amendment. And I think that really will allow the legislature and state agencies to really weigh in on the actual rules and regulations that this is really promoting. We as voters are just saying we want to know more about our food supply, I think.
You watched all this go on, Brenda. You,
Yes.
of course, were not part of the panel, but observing it and helping to facilitate. How did you guess this was all going to turn out, the vote?
I had no idea, and I usually pride myself in being able to look ahead. I had no idea. The panelists, they were randomly selected, and they demographically represented Colorado. So you have Bill and Ben. We had a young man, 19 years old, from Alamosa, someone from the Western Slope, Colorado Springs, Pueblo, Fort Collins, ranging from 19 maybe to mid to late 70s. So I had no idea, and people they took this public service really seriously, that they are offering another way for voters to obtain information about this important measure. And so I had no idea how either one of these gentlemen would vote in the end. To be honest, it kind of surprised me based on things that they had said throughout the process. So I was surprised and we were thrilled. Just want to emphasize that this is not in the Blue Book, because our Blue Book is
prepared by the Legislative Council.
Yes. So just want to emphasize this is on the website.
But you did hear from some of the people who prepare the Blue Book, right? What did you find out from them?
They did provide a good overview of the law and as it was being proposed. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting in the, as Ben mentioned, that the state would fill in the blanks in the rule and the state would oversee it. But also in the Blue Book, I believe they estimated that the state would look at 30 items a year, test them to make sure that they're properly labeled. And at 30 items per year, it would take them about over 13,000 years to look at everything. So again, that kind of proves my point that I just don't think it's inadequate.
Okay, so I guess it's pretty clear now. This panel ended up voting 11-9 in favor of the amendment, but clearly Bill is against it. He went into it kind of for it, and he's now against it. Ben was in for it. You liked it at the beginning. You still do.
I had an idea about GMO labeling, and that's what I really appreciated with the Citizens Initiative Review process. Is the devil is always in the details of our amendments and how they are written. And so I may have had an idea of what I thought about GMO labeling, but through the process, it really just reinforced why I do think this is a good proposition for Colorado.
Brenda, when you invited the proponents and opponents to present to these people, I know they were very passionate about, what information they were going to be able to impart, but you pointed out to them, or afterwards, that this is really kind of an excellent focus group for both of them, wouldn't you say?
I would say. I mean, how often, for those of you that have worked campaigns, get an opportunity to spend 3.5 days with a cross-section of Colorado voters, actually, and have it, to be honest, be provided for you, and to really listen to their deliberations and ask the questions, test your message. So I think both campaigns had an opportunity to really hear the concerns and the questions that Coloradans have about Proposition 105.
And as you were looking at all of it in those 3 days, did you feel as though that it all became less complex to you, and that this would be quite the service you could offer your fellow voters to give them your summary?
Yes, it was a very interesting process. And while we were going through it, at the time we were going through it, it seemed like it was more important to get the information out and to just understand the different pros and cons about it. And I didn't even realize that my opinion had changed until we got to the end and we were required to vote, because I was so interested in just trying to understand and dig in and to get information that I think people would want to know about before they had to vote on this measure. So
we all have seen these ads that we're mostly seeing ads against it, because that's where the most of the money is being spent. At this point, Katie Kuntz in our iNews newsroom looked it up yesterday. I think she said the opponents have raised $11 million, and the proponents haven't even raised $500,000. So that is the lopsided finances of the whole thing. What would you tell people who are looking at those ads?
I would, and again, I think this is where some of the challenge we have in states that have voter initiatives like this is that all too often they will just listen to those ads, and I would really invite them to take the time to really read the amendment and learn about it before making a decision.
Well, that, of course, is what we want to let people know, that if you go to CIRcolorado.org, that's Citizens Initiative Review, that's what CIR is, you will find the one-page summary that this group of people came up with, and some of the interesting facts that you may not have known were in the initiative. I guess last question to you, what did you learn that surprised you, either about what a GMO ingredient is or something in the initiative?
What I learned is I like corn, and I've been eating genetically modified corn for probably over 20 years and never really realized it.
Does that concern you?
A little, because I'm not sure that there's a complete understanding about the effects or the impacts that genetically modified food has on the human body. And I'd like for them to research that before we get much further down the road.
And that's right. There are no definitive studies really at this moment about GMO foods and how they affect people. Ben, last comment from you.
I couldn't agree more in learning. Again, kind of Bill just says, talking about what we are putting in our bodies, I think we have a right to know what we're putting in our bodies. And that, at the very bottom line, is why I'm going to vote for Proposition 105.
All right, you can check out those results at circolorado.org. Thank you very much to Bill Wright, Ben Hamilton, and to Brenda Morrison of Engaged Public.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
From GMO technology in food production to technology in biomedical devices. As we know, some amazing tools have been developed for people with disabilities. Colorado's Craig Hospital is at the forefront when it comes to treating people with spinal cord injuries, including those who are paralyzed. Now comes a revolutionary device that can allow such individuals to stand up and walk. It's called an exoskeleton, smart technology that can work with the body to tell the legs to move. For now, these are used primarily in rehabilitation facilities like Craig, but one model recently received FDA approval for home use. Reporter Mary McCarthy recently spent a morning at Craig with patient James Knoll and his therapist, who have been training on the exobionic legs since 2012.
Yep. Where do you want me to go? Okay. My name is James Knoll. I'm 32 years old. Right now I'm a full-time student at Metropolitan State University of Denver, studying Bachelor in Science and Accounting. August 2010, I came home from work. My previous career was in restaurant management, and it was my 2 days off, and I was just doing normal duties around the house, and top floor of my house is hardwood floor, and my left foot slipped, and my trajectory essentially went parallel with the stairs, and I snapped my neck at the bottom on my basement. I sustained a C6-7 vertebrae fracture. When I look at the exoskeleton, as far as where it's brought me into my rehabilitative side, huge difference. Huge on the sense of psychological, gaining that aspect of feeling that muscle memory, or feeling that, they call it a gait pattern, a walking pattern. You still pushing me forward?
Yeah, just a little.
Okay. Here, I'm going to try moving with my legs as well.
I'm Julie Hartman. I'm a physical therapist and the clinical coordinator of the Peak Center at Craig Hospital. The exoskeleton is a wearable, battery-operated robot. It allows any individual with any ability, so they don't have to have any movement at all or some movement, and it allows them to stand up and walk. I've known James for over 4 years now as actually his inpatient therapist. And I am a tall girl, and I was a tall PT, so for him, he wanted to prove me wrong that he was taller than me. And I would tease him, and inpatient say, "Nah, no, you're not," you know. Well, this was the way that we were able to tell that he was actually taller than me. So he stood up for the first time, and him and I just started cracking up because he was an inch taller than me.
It's tough. It's tough coming in here day in and day out. And for me, this is my NFL combine. I come in here with the best of what I got, and I give it over 100%. It's not just about exoskeleton or, you know, coming up with this miraculous stem cell or mobility or independence. I mean, it goes broader than that. I want to show to the medical community, rehabilitative community, family members that it doesn't end once you get injured.
That report from Mary McCarthy of Feature Story News. And now to energy. The International Energy Agency says the U.S. is on track to become the world's top producer of oil. But the oil boom is also leading to a boom in toxic oil field waste and increasing concerns over the dangers these disposal sites pose for air quality. Right now, oil and gas waste is officially considered non-hazardous because of a decision made by Congress and the EPA in 1988 to spur domestic oil oil production and to keep costs low by exempting oil and gas waste from federal regulations. But people who live near such waste pits in Colorado or any of the Western energy-producing states say the smell alone is enough to convince them there's something foul afoot that should be addressed. Dan Boyce of our Inside Energy team joins me now. First of all, describe what these pits look like, or what are they made of or next to?
The ones we're talking about here are solid waste pits. So basically, if an oil company comes in, drills a well, it's the stuff that they are pulling out of the ground when they're drilling that isn't the oil or the gas that they want. It's the dirt, the soil, the rocks, and that kind of stuff. And that's mixed in with the oil. It's some little bits of oil. It's mixed in with some other compounds, and it becomes this sort of sludge. Now, there are compounds within this sludge that are considered hazardous in other circumstances, like right on the drilling site, for instance, when the oil companies are drilling. But when they're placed in these waste pits, it's no longer considered hazardous. And as you point out, due to federal decisions back in 1988. These are crazy sounding chemicals like benzene and xylene and toluene. And these chemicals, the oil industry says that they're not in high enough amounts within this waste to be putting out air emissions that are hazardous to health, but the air emissions aren't measured. So it's very difficult to tell if they are at dangerous levels.
Well, let's take a look at a graphic from Inside Climate News, which was part of this story as well. Let's, closer look at some of these chemicals that we're talking about. Benzene, for instance, it can cause some pretty serious damage.
So several of these compounds are carcinogens. Many of them do have adverse impacts to the nervous system if they are seen at higher doses. You can see benzene is a carcinogen that can lead to leukemia, can damage blood cells in the nervous system. Ethylbenzene can cause respiratory problems and also has damaging impacts toward the nervous system. Toluene, liver damage, brain damage, kidney damage, and it can even impair and harm a developing fetus. And finally, xylene can damage the liver, kidneys, and the nervous system as well.
So none of this sounds very good, but it does matter the amounts of these things that may be emitted from the pits, right?
Yep, and it's unclear at what level these compounds are considered hazardous. Depending on who you talk to, different health officials have different opinions on that.
There's a good example in the story about Nordheim, Texas, dealing with a waste pit there. Tell us about that.
Right. So they are really they're a poster child for the concern here. Nordheim is a tiny little town in Texas, a few thousand people, and one of these waste pits, these disposal waste pits of this sludge we were talking about, it's being proposed and built right outside of their town, right on the town's borders, and the pit is so large that it's almost as big as the entire downtown of Nordheim. And so there are concerns that there is a school within the town where 180 children go, and there are concerns from parents and neighbors who say they can smell something that doesn't smell right coming off of these pits, and they're having different symptoms like headaches, nosebleeds, and the like.
Is something like that, then, a case like that, going to push the EPA to reconsider the way they look at hazardous waste?
It's hard to know what the EPA will do regarding these waste pits, but as we are seeing more and more drilling and thus more and more of these waste pits, you're seeing communities on the case-by-case basis take action. There are about 20 communities, at least 20 communities across the country that have banned any pits like this within their city limits. Vermont recently passed, a couple of years ago, they passed restrictions on these pits. Connecticut has passed a 3-year restriction on these pits as well. So states are looking at it individually. And there's also a first-term congressman from Pennsylvania who is proposing that these waste pits be labeled as hazardous rather than non-hazardous as they are now. that bill doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Right.
That makes me wonder if a city says put it outside the city limits, then it has to be trucked there from wherever it was. And if the concern is about air pollution, then the pollution may be being released along the road as well.
It depends. I mean, there are certainly different ways of handling this pollution. It can be in contained tanks, and that's what happens oftentimes with disposal waste water. It's handled in a closed system, and so it could be something that's done with this waste as well. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention again Inside Climate News's reporting and long work on this. They work together with the Center for Public Integrity, Inside Climate News being a different organization than Inside Energy. Those two organizations also worked very hard on this story for a year and a half, and I would suggest anybody check out their work on this too.
Thank you, Dan Boyce. And you can find that story at rmpbs.org/news. That's Colorado State of Mind for this weekend. You may see our program again, including the first segment on the GMO ballot issue at video.rmpbs.org. Next week, why is the Veterans Benefits Administration demanding money back from veterans? Thousands of dollars, which the agency says they overpaid. We'll tell you the story of one Colorado Air Force vet. That's next week. Thanks for tuning in tonight. I'm Cynthia Hessen of Rocky Mountain PBSI News. Good night.
Did not know that as many countries do have the GMO labeling already in place. I mean, Russia, China, all of the EU.